Building Bridges with Michael Hershman.
Hello, I'm Michael Hershman, and welcome to Building Bridges, that which unites us. A candid conversation about culture, democracy, and finding common ground. This week, I'm thrilled to be joined by Richard Esposito and citizens on the street. Richard is an award-winning journalist and author. He has been a reporter, editor, a news executive, and most recently, he was senior executive producer of the NBC News Investigative Unit. Richard is a 5-time Emmy Award winner, has won a Peabody and a shared Pulitzer, and also has written 2 books, The Bomb Squad and the biography of Jimmy Breslin. And if that isn't enough, he also served as New York City Deputy Police Commissioner for Public Information. Welcome to the show, Richard. Richard, it seems like to me that you've been in journalism since you've been 3 years old. How did you decide to get into that industry?
You know, Mike, that's one of those wonderful things that used to happen in New York. I came home from Berkeley, and they offered me a job as a clerk at the Daily News. And that was the beginning. And within 3 years, I was reporting on crime and living a wonderful life in New York. But it was one of those happy accidents, the first moment of it. My friend was leaving the Daily News, and he wrote a note saying, please give my friend my job. And that was how it began. That's a way that the world doesn't work anymore.
You must have fallen in love with it at some point.
It was the greatest thing walking into the Daily News building. If you recall, there's a globe that's like 12 feet in diameter, 8 feet tall, and turns around in a marble lobby. When I walked into that lobby, I thought, this is where I want to work for the rest of my life. What a beautiful place to begin, you know?
Well, that's wonderful. So, look, you've covered everything from Hurricane Sandy to the killing of Osama bin Laden.
Yeah.
What was your favorite story that you covered?
You know, one of the most delightful stories I covered when I was young was a man who was the last newsie in New York, a man named Firpo. He was named after the boxer who got knocked out of the ring by Dempsey. And he would stand in front of the Wall Street station shouting what he thought the headline should be. So he would reduce it to one word, war. So I was sent down there as a 22-year-old reporter to interview him and write that story. It was a delight. You know, the big stories come when they come, but these little ones, these moments that are only in New York, are just a delight. You know, it was just a wonderful moment. The first big story was this man who was slashing nurses, and I found him before the police got to him in what used to be a rooming house on Lexington Avenue. I walked up, there were no numbers, they'd sold all the brass numbers. I walked up to the 3rd floor of this rooming house, and there was one door that had a picture of Marlon Brando from On the Waterfront after he'd been beaten up. And I said, well, this must be my guy. I knocked on the door, and he opened it with the chain on, and he had the sword cane on the bed, but he had a paper bag over his head with the eyes cut out. And I said, you know, I just really have one question. Why haven't the police caught you yet? He said, the detectives are inept. And I was like, okay, I've got it. And then I convinced him to take the bag off so we can get a good photo. And that was the first big story. And that's where I met our friend, John Miller, after that story. We were both pretty young guys.
And John Miller, of course, preceded you as the Deputy Commissioner for the New York City Public Information. He was that some years ago. And of course, you were that more recently. How did that happen? How did you go from journalism to inside this major police department and dealing with the bureaucracy that entails?
You know, I really wanted to do public service, and I really worked hard to get that job. You know, de Blasio was the mayor, and he had the sign-off. So the police commissioner wanted me, and I had to convince the mayor of New York that I was the right guy, and I managed to do that. But like John, I wanted to try to do some public service. He did much more than me. He's done it 3 times for the FBI and the police department, but it's a whole different world working inside a government agency, 54,000 people. And you learn what civil service is like. There are people who are there because they really want to do good, and there are people who are there because you get a good pension and health care. That's the way civil service works, a mix. So, of course, there was COVID, George Floyd protest, crime going up. So my time there was, I had a bedroom in my office in case you had to stay there on Saturday and Sunday, because it was just nonstop.
Well, so look, New York is different from, I've always considered New York the center of the universe, and you're a New Yorker, I'm a New Yorker, right? You've covered local news, you've covered national news, you've covered international news. How is it different being a reporter in New York than anywhere else in the world?
I also think of New York as the center of the universe, because if you live here, everything is at your fingertips. Local news, you touch and feel your audience, and you're speaking directly to your audience. And tomorrow, they're going to call you if you get it right or wrong. It's a very personal business, local news. And local, network news reporters and TV, they're big, they're important, or at least they think so. They cover Washington. Local news reporters, they cover the mayor, they cover a murder in a neighborhood that affects a family. I had 17 years of local news before I started covering national security and network news. And that experience grounds you so well in understanding everything you do touches someone. So I loved local news, absolutely loved it. And I still do it. I still, for CBS News, I work both for network and for local. I'm their law enforcement expert now. So it's a consulting job, and I'm there like every week, and it's delightful.
So look, but is there a difference between New York-based reporters and reporters in Los Angeles or Miami or Detroit, Houston?
I like to think so. There are great reporters in Miami, Chicago, San Francisco. Reporters who cover a city or a state work incredibly hard, and you can always learn something from them. The first thing you should do if you're a network person or a national news person when you get to a new city is call the local police reporter or politics reporter and learn what it is that they think is important. And if they're nice enough, they'll help you learn. So there are great reporters everywhere in this country, and they work harder now than ever before. There's less reporters. Every newspaper's cut them back. Every news organization is smaller. So they work harder than when I began the job, and there were 6 or 7 editions of a newspaper. Now it's nonstop, all day long. They're filing copy, they're getting on camera. One of my friends was on camera 180 times in the first 6 months of last year. Think about the pace of that.
So, but the business has changed so dramatically. You have now something called social media.
Yeah.
And you have conspiracy theorists on both the left and the right, and time is dead and distance is moot. But anything can happen at any time, and all of a sudden be news. What's the challenge to the more traditional reporters today?
The challenge is always getting it right. And if you remember the Boston Marathon bombing, which is only about 8 years ago, but it seems like decades ago, suddenly people were announcing who the suspects were. And there's a lot of pressure on you to match that. And there's a lot of pressure to tell your bosses that's not the right suspect. And they need it now. And you're sitting there saying, you'll get it when we have it, but this isn't it. So that's the challenge of when news, the pace of news is so fast. Get it right, even if it means you're second. That's life. Getting it wrong means you're going to get sued and means you've embarrassed your company. So the pace is a real challenge, and that divisiveness that you talked about in our society, where there's all sides are in silos and they're almost talking to themselves. And how do you bridge both sides and get a story out or a message out that even if somebody might disagree, they're there to listen. So that's the storytelling challenge right now, is how do you get out of those silos?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because you just published a book on Jimmy Breslin, who was one of the most creative journalists in the history of New York, if not the country. Hard drinking, chain smoking, cursing, kind of the model for the old-time journalists. He believed deeply, however, in telling people stories and in telling the truth. And he reported during a time in our country, the Vietnam War, where there was divisiveness. We had demonstrations in the streets, we had bombings, the country was torn apart literally. I want you to put yourself in Jimmy's shoes. You knew him personally. Obviously, you researched him, you studied him. What would he think about the divisive nature of our society today? What would he be reporting about?
You know, if you had to ask Jimmy today, what are the two things that your readers really care about if they're New Yorkers, which is where he worked? One would be Eric Adams, and the other would be Donald Trump. So what are the stories you tell about Eric Adams and Donald Trump? And how do you tell them? Jimmy tried to tell stories seeing it through your eyes. That's a real challenge, not telling you what happened, but seeing it with you. So with Eric Adams, the day that he wore two baseball caps, essentially, he was rooting for two teams, that's something everybody understands. And he would probably start with that, because he's trying to get to the heart of who is Eric Adams. And if Eric Adams is a guy who wears two hats, you can tell that story. Donald Trump, he would hearken back to when Donald Trump wanted to kill all the kids in the Central Park allegations that they had raped a woman and put her into a coma. There was no trial yet. There was no evidence presented yet. And Jimmy wrote about that. And the president talks off the cuff. And sometimes you hear him on Monday, and then on Tuesday he says something else. Jimmy would write about that and try and convey to you, take your time and listen and see what he's actually saying, not what's coming out right then. So he would be writing about those two things. And I think he would try to write about him in a way that whether you were someone who voted for Trump, someone who didn't vote for Trump, you would understand who the president was. That's what he would try and convey. And remember, he knew the president from when he was a young man. He saw him in a light that most reporters today don't know. So he would be able to tell you about the evolution of a person. Same with Eric Adams. He knew him when he was a cop. Eric Adams was a cop in Brooklyn. And he would remind you of what he was like then.
Given his background, his upbringing, his childhood in Queens, and I get the impression that he was really, truly a patriot, that he loved America. Is that true?
Yeah, Jimmy loved America. Jimmy loved democracy. Jimmy loved honest cops. He's often been criticized for disliking cops. That's not true. He disliked the kind of cops you and I might dislike, corrupt cops. But if a policeman had an open mind, as one policeman who happened to come to my book signing, Jerry Kane, sergeant in covered robbery. Jerry said, you open the paper, you might not know what he was going to write, and it might be something you didn't like, but it was always interesting. And that's the kind of policeman he liked, someone who cared about the law, cared about his cases, and had an open mind. And believe me, of the 36,000 police officers in New York, 34 right now, many of them are those kind of people. And Jimmy cared about that. So he cared deeply about democracy. One of his best friends was the governor of New York at the time, Mario Cuomo. And he understood something Mario said. The governor's job's to govern, and my job's to make sure he governs well. And that's his friend he's talking about. And Mario understood that, and he understood that. That's how much he cared about our country.
What do you think his take would have been on the politicalization of the word democracy in our recent elections? Is democracy, is there really a threat to democracy? What about the principles? You know, we have a birthday coming up, 2026, the 250-year anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. They talked about life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Would he be disappointed in the atmosphere, the political atmosphere today?
I think any open-minded, honest person would be disappointed in the atmosphere. And he would try and capture that from the point of view of, for example, if you threaten Social Security, most of the people who voted for Donald Trump, that is more than half of their retirement income. Some of them, it's all of it. He would write about that and how that threatens the stability of our society when everyone over 65 is economically threatened. What are they going to do?
So he loved people. He loved to tell stories about people. So we're going to take a minute now to listen to some of the people in the street that we've interviewed and get your reactions to some of the things that they're telling us.
Nobody has a voice. We're all suits. We're all just, involved in corporate America. We put your dress clothes on. I got my slacks on. I got my dress shirt on. I go to work from 9 to 5. I come home and I'm a robot. And that's about it. Democracy is totally dead. Nobody has a voice unless you're a big corporation. And that's really all it.
I think they do. Do I think it goes in waves? Absolutely. And I think people are sometimes afraid of saying what they want to say. They're afraid of starting arguments. But I think with the surge of social media, people are not afraid to share what they feel. So
it's basically a dictatorship at this point. Trump basically, he's a businessman at the heart of it all. So a businessman doesn't think of a democracy. He doesn't think of people. He thinks of the economy. And that's not what democracy is. So I believe it's dwindling down. I'm not saying people still don't have a voice. People are definitely trying to use that voice, but it's not as heard as much as we'd like to be.
You know, New York is a parochial place. And sometimes when you're on, it's a borough. New York has essentially four boroughs are on islands. And that's what New York is like. Parochial place where people live in Brooklyn, that's on an island. Queens, that's on an island. Manhattan, that's on an island. Staten Island, that is an island. It's a parochial city. The only part of the city connected to America is the Bronx. That's the only part of New York on the mainland of the United States. So sometimes we lose sight of those 2,900 miles of beautiful country. Many of us have never gone farther than the airport and a trip to somewhere on vacation. There's America out there, and we're a little disconnected at times. And America, in fairness to us, is a little disconnected from us. This is the economic engine of the country. 15%, I think, of the gross national product comes from New York City. Think about that. One city, that's how much of the economy.
But does that mean, in part, that others living outside of New York City, whether it's Montana or Texas, or think of New Yorkers as being kind of arrogant?
And it's such a misconception to think New Yorkers are arrogant. We're actually very nice. If you ask a New Yorker for directions, you get them in a complete sentence. If you ask someone for directions in Los Angeles, I asked a police officer for directions, and he didn't know anything but the part of LA he lived in. And a New Yorker would be able to tell you how to get from here to Williamsburg. Take the L train, you get off at the third stop. How do you get to Harlem? Take the A train, get off at 125th Street. That kind of kindness that you see in New Yorkers is lost on a lot of people. They hear our accent, which sounds abrasive. They see our pace, which seems remarkably fast to someone from San Francisco. They don't see the soul and heart of New Yorkers, who are very diverse. First-generation immigrants make up a lot of this city. People from Ecuador are here selling goods, moving into their first job. People who came here and do lawn care, their kids are the honor students in the schools. It's a wonderful place, and the antipathy to New York is something that you really wish you could break through.
So the rest of the country needs more New Yorkers from what you've described.
We should move everywhere, you know? That's-
So, Richard, we did ask some of the folks on the street, the good New Yorkers, if they knew the Pledge of Allegiance, and let's see what happens.
I pledge allegiance to the United States of America, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Pledge allegiance to the flag, to the United States of America, and to the republic for which we stand, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of United States of America and to the republic of which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The Pledge of Allegiance? I haven't done this one in a while. I know it starts like this for sure. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
You know, the Pledge of Allegiance was the start of my day for 8 years of school. Every morning at St. Joseph's, you got up, they said a prayer, and then they said the Pledge of Allegiance. You would not have gotten past first grade without knowing it. Now I think it's voluntary, so you wonder why schools would not educate the students as to our pledge to our country. So it's not surprising that someone might not know it, but it's also not their fault because no one taught them. So the people who didn't teach them, in essence, are damaging a country, if you think about it that way, because don't you need to know the system you live in? And that's in a very simple, I pledge allegiance to the flag. It's a simple way to state what this country's about.
So I went back, I was curious when I heard the responses, and I went back and did a little research about why there was opposition to the Pledge of Allegiance. I, like you, did it every day in school, and I gather it's because of the line, one nation under God. And there was an objection to that because of the secular nature of our country. I mean, that it just doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, that's a confusion of the separation of church and state. There is a separation of church and state, but the country began as a country under God. And it is not meant to be one God, my God, your God. It's meant to be, there's a spiritual center to the nation. And to misunderstand that is to misunderstand what the founding fathers were really trying to say there. They're not against atheists. They're not only for a Christian God. They're just for a nation that respects that there's something greater than ourselves. And that's an important part of a country that's not just nationalistic. It's a country that recognizes there's something bigger than us. And that's, I think, all it means.
And I agree with you 100%. Richard, you also wrote a book called The Bomb Squad. And was that turned into a movie, or?
No, there was an attempt to make a movie, but they never actually made it. There are movies about bomb squads. You know, Hurt Locker about the Army bomb squad is a famous one. I was with the NYPD bomb squad and used that as a vehicle of telling how bombs have been diffused over decades in our country by a very small group of people who were trained to do that and only that. Remarkable group. I lived with them for a year. Every week I would spend a couple of days at the bomb squad. Went to bomb school, went to advanced post-blast school. You wouldn't want me to do anything, but I learned what they do. And it was a wonderful way to write a book, you know?
So I wouldn't want you to defuse a bomb.
No.
I might ask you to change a light bulb, but not to defuse a bomb.
Even a light bulb is close to the end of my grip of technology. But
Okay, but let me ask you this. Do you have to be crazy to be a member of a bomb squad?
you know, that's the old joke. Like if somebody asks to be a member of the bomb squad, the chief of detectives will say, "Go ahead, because you're nuts." They're actually people who walk very slowly toward danger in a measured way. They don't run, they walk. They walk slow. They know how to take a bomb apart. They know how some bombs you shouldn't try to take apart. When, after 9/11, there was a concern of a nuclear radioactive bomb in New York, very serious, Washington only has one team that can defuse those bombs. And the man who ran intelligence at the time, Inspector Charlie Luisi, the man who ran intelligence knew that that bomb squad was going to stay in Washington if there was a nuclear threat. So they approached all the retired bomb technicians, grandfathers, and they all volunteered to be the people who would try to take that bomb apart, because they knew they were going to die of radiation poisoning, whether they got the bomb diffused or not, because this wasn't shielded. So that's the kind of people that do this for a living. They're willing to give up the rest of their life in a circumstance like that. To me, that was phenomenal. I interviewed all these grandfathers, and they've already had a career, they have children, grandchildren, and now they're going to do it one more time at a great risk to their life. That's who they are. There's less than 40 of them in New York City.
And they're civil servants.
They're civil servants.
They don't get extra pay for doing this, do they?
No, they get the pay you get. They get overtime, of course. They get camaraderie because they're a tight-knit group. They have dogs that they take home, that they're partners for some of them, the dogs that go out and sniff for explosives. No, they do this because they love their work. And, you know, I spent time with the Los Angeles bomb squad. There's a bomb squad that's run by a fire department in the country and in Nevada. And there are women bomb technicians and men, and they are phenomenally dedicated people. You don't do this for money. You don't say, I'm going to walk up to a truck that is a bomb and take it apart because someone's giving you a little extra pay. You know, I went to London to meet their bomb guys. Imagine being in Ireland and having a 1,000-pound bomb to take apart. And you're wearing an armored suit that, you know, stop a couple of pounds of explosives, knock you down. Nothing's stopping a 1,000-pound bomb. One of the guys that did this did it over and over for years. Then he went to London and became the deputy head of the London bomb squad, which is civilian.
So these are truly civil servant heroes. I'm reminded of the recent Doge cuts in the federal system. And we all know that there needs to be a downsizing in the federal government, getting rid of waste and fraud and mismanagement. No argument there. But there have been some missteps. I mean, they laid off folks that are responsible for the nuclear safety program, and they brought them back on. And same also with the air traffic controllers. Some of them were laid off, and of course when they realized what they did, they brought them back on. You know, I would hope that there's no effort to downsize the bomb squad or to get rid of the bomb squad, because it's not that easy to learn how to do something like this, right?
It is not easy at all. Look, the people who are running that particular program have limited experience with the government. Some of them have limited experience with life. They're in their 20s. Bureaucracies always get too big, and they always need to be cut. It's how you cut them. New York has 325,000 public servants. At times it's been cut back to 250,000. Then it grows again, then you need to cut it back. But you cut it with a scalpel. And you know, the FBI does all the training. So you hope that those FBI agents down at Quantico that train all the bomb squads. And what's important about that is every bomb squad in the country can work with any bomb squad in the country. They all have the same training. So you don't want to damage something like that. And there are lots of examples of cutting too fast and too deep with less thought than one might need. Cutting is fine. You've worked in business your whole life. You know what cutting things is. I've worked in news. I've had to face staff cuts. It's how you do it. And you need to do it with humanity. And that's something that you learn. You know, Elon Musk has never been a government employee, and he's a genius at what he's a genius at. But this is brand new to him. And you don't just come in and say, I'm going to do it with a chainsaw. And they've pulled back from that, as they should have. And they'll look at it a different way, I hope.
Yeah, they've learned as they've gone along. But obviously, the bomb squad, that's completely voluntary.
Right.
Except for the dogs.
Except for the dogs. The dogs very often come out of jails. They find, you know, dogs that have been with prisoners. They find dogs in pounds. The dogs are not volunteers, but it's a life-changing experience for them. Now they have a family. They get fed really good dog food. They have a beautiful home. And they've got someone who every day loves them. The person who's attached to the dog lives with that dog. That's their partner. That dog is, in a sense, the first line of defense against the bomb.
But on the other hand, when they're introduced to the tactic of finding bombs, you've never seen one say, I'm not doing that. Are you crazy?
I've never seen that. It would be pretty funny to see a dog say, time out. I'd like to be a narcotics dog. You know, it seems easier.
Going back again to the late 60s and early 70s, a troubled time in our country, a time when I was in the military, actually. We saw a lot of bombings. We saw a lot of violence in the streets, demonstrations and otherwise. We're now seeing a different kind of violence. We recently saw a CEO who was killed here in Manhattan, who worked in the pharmaceutical industry, by a young man who had the motivations he had. Won't go into them right now. But do you see a change in the nature of risk and violence, both here in New York City and in the rest of the country?
Risk always changes. So the first vehicle bomb was in 1920 at a bank in New York, not in Afghanistan. Now, in the 60s and 70s, you had the Puerto Rican liberation movement. There were several hundred bombs in New York that you didn't know about because there was no social media, but somebody went out to do that. How's that get to today? One of the biggest threats today, not just to New York City, are sovereign nation types, people who are domestic, potential terrorists and terrorists. Those bombs are crude, they're often small. Don't tell that to the victim of the shrapnel. So that's one of the risks, and they're always studying what the risks are. Their job is to take them apart, so they need to know how they were built. The FBI and the investigative people at the big police departments, their job is to find the bomber. So when you look at what the present day risk is, that's not the bomb technician's job. They start with a clean desk every morning. That's the job of the people behind the bomb squad, who you know well, the intelligence officers, the counterterror people. And they've been focusing very much more on the threats within our country. Luigi Mangione, the guy who killed, allegedly, the CEO of the health company, he had considered using a bomb instead of a gun. He decided not to use a bomb because he thought, well, it'll hurt innocent people. We're pretty lucky that that was his decision.
Yet he shot the executive because, allegedly, he shot the executive because he was angry at the healthcare system.
Right.
in the United States. Now we've had the Unabomber, we've had the Oklahoma City bombing. These were anti-government activists, if you will. Here we have an anti-corporate activist, and I know that you advise corporations on crisis response. How does this change the nature of your work, or your advisory work?
You know, a lot of CEOs of big companies have not thought carefully about their personal security, as you also know. So how's it changed the nature of my advisory work? In the immediate aftermath of that shooting, instead of doing crisis communications, I was doing essentially find a company to assess your physical security at all of your facilities. Find people who are capable at close protection. High-profile executives in the entertainment industry have different risks than the ones in the healthcare insurance industry. The anger is different, but the measures you have to take, as you know, are the same. Who's providing your personal security? Who are your vendors? Do they have background checks? What is your burglar alarm system? Do you have a safe room? All of those things became part of my conversations with clients. And I was glad, because no one should be hurt because you have an anger at an industry, whether it's the movie industry or Hollywood or the insurance industry. And the healthcare industry is in all of our lives. And there's a huge amount of anger over it, and a lot of it correctly so, because of the way they use computers to reject claims. And there's not even a human touch to the person who might need cataract surgery, for example, or some other kind of important care. But that's not the way to approach a problem in our society, is it? So it's anger at corporate America, or anger at an industry because you don't like the music or you don't like the movies, and it's taken out on a human being who has a family and a life. And so you provide them with the advice on how to go about their day-to-day life, whether they fly private jets or commercial airlines. How do they handle security? And how do they know they have the right people around them? This might have been prevented had the security been different. The CEO was alone. I would say now you would be hard-pressed to find a CEO who's alone when they're traveling in public.
Do you, is there any, on this particular case, is there any takeaway you have from the fact that he was shot multiple times in the back rather than in the front?
Fair play has nothing to do with an angry human being. And him shooting him in the back that was his first shot. He took it. Then his second shot, he took it. Then the man turned and he took it again. There's no way to get inside the head of a killer, alleged killer in this case, and ask why they did it that way. But that was the shot he had, so he took it. Just like an assassin, in essence, you know, a mob assassin. They don't really walk up to you and say, "Hi, I'm just going to shoot you now." They shoot you, front or back. When they pull the gun, they don't talk.
I want to go back to our brief discussion of democracy and the principles underlying democracy. In this time of change, in this time of unhappiness, a lot of people in the country are unhappy. Now, New Yorkers are always unhappy about something.
Generally.
It's in their DNA.
Yeah.
If New Yorkers didn't complain, the world would come to an end. Do you agree with that?
I totally agree.
Yeah.
There are two things we don't like: what we have now and what we might have later.
Exactly. And by the way, I find that charming about New Yorkers.
Yeah. Gives us something to talk about.
Yeah, exactly. But there was a survey not long ago, and 38% of the people in the country that were surveyed didn't think that patriotism was important. How do we protect the underlying principles, one of which is, of course, very important to you, and that is freedom of press. We have freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of press. In this time and age when some people are not sure whether democracy is good, and let me just qualify what I'm saying. This is not a perfect democracy. There's no such thing as a perfect democracy. We have our shortcomings as a country, but how do we protect those underlying principles for our future generations?
You know, one of the first things in protecting a constitution, and we're lucky, ours is written. England's constitution is not in writing. They say they have one, but you can't see it. One of the ways to protect our democracy, I think, is learning those amendments to the Constitution. The First Amendment, the right to bear arms, the Second Amendment, the right to privacy, the Fourth Amendment. These teaching what those mean is teaching what democracy is. It's about your rights. Our central government doesn't govern the states in an authoritarian way. That's the kind of democracy we've chosen to have, and there's a reason for it. So education is the buttress that protects democracy, and understanding that your vote protects democracy. So in New York, we have horrible voter turnout. You win in a primary, it's almost a one-party city in New York City, and nobody shows up. So you get the mayor that a very small group of people thought should be mayor. Whose fault is that? Well, part of it is our fault for not voting, and part of it is people not educating us as to why that right to vote is so important. So I would say education is the first way to protect a democracy. And the second way is by that vote, who you pick to represent you.
Is there any hope that we could bring back civil debate?
You know, I think so. I'm an optimist. So there was a time when there would be a William Buckley on the right and a Jimmy Breslin in the middle and a Murray Kempton on the left. And afterward, they would talk to each other. And they were friendly to each other. And they respected each other's point of view. I see no reason we won't go back there. I see this as a moment in time, and I hope we survive it. But I believe we can.
New York has outsized influence. We're the financial capital of the country. We're the cultural capital of the country. Some people think we're the sports capital of the country, but others would argue.
Exactly.
How can we weigh in on the most important topics today nationally and make ourselves be heard and make ourselves be, let's leave it at make ourselves be heard?
You know, that's a challenge. How do you make yourself heard and understood? So in the financial world, Jamie Dimon, who runs, I guess, the largest bank in the country, he makes himself heard. Now, is his opinion all our opinion? No, but he's figured out how to use his bank as a pulpit. When Mike Bloomberg was mayor just a couple of terms ago, he made himself heard about gun control. He brought every mayor to Washington to explain why what we cared about was not legal guns, but illegal guns, as if that they didn't quite understand that what we wanted was to get rid of illegal guns, not take away guns from people who have them legally. He spoke out in a national way. So now you have to ask, what are the national issues where our voice matters? Certainly the financial markets, our voice matters. We have some of the smartest people in the country here. Austin has a great financial community. They're pretty smart on it. We need to speak out on what needs to happen in the financial markets. It affects everyone. What's going on right now is terrifying to older people because they don't have the time to recover from what might become a recession. They don't have those years on the back end. You have to explain that to people clearly, not in a partisan way, just clearly. How else do we speak to the rest of the country? Well, we have one of the most intelligent cardinals you could possibly have. He's a good spokesman for New York, and he can, although he's retiring soon. He's reached retirement age. I didn't know that clergy had retirement age, but I've learned something new this week. And so Cardinal Dolan. And then What is the rest of our responsibility? I don't know, but I do know if we're going to have a vision for the future of New York, we have to tell the country what New York means to them and why we care about them. Again, Mike Bloomberg had that kind of vision. He was kind of wonderful choice as a mayor in his time because he was trying to think about how do you go from a city that was based on finance, accounting, and law into a city that, to succeed and grow in the future, might have to rely more on culture and might have to rely on technology, which we didn't have a tech industry here. And now we have one. So you need mayors and governors who aren't just thinking about tomorrow, but they're thinking about the future and how that future relates to the country.
So in order for New York to remain relevant, in order for it to remain important, it has to grow. It has to look forward and not look back. We have to overcome some of the problems we face in the city. Lack of affordable housing, crime, and other issues. We can't afford to be stagnant. Would you agree with that?
You know, I agree with 100%. We can't afford to be stagnant. And so you ask, whose responsibility is that? And that becomes the political class. You want to keep business here? What's your tax policy? You want to keep workers here when they no longer have to be here. I can work somewhere else. I can work on Long Island. I can work in Connecticut. What do you do to maintain people who are generating the money you need to run the city? They need to hear from you what you're doing to attract them and keep them here. Young people, can they afford $8,000 a month Manhattan rents? No. So they're living 2, 3, and 4 in an apartment that's meant for a couple and 2 children. Is that any way to keep people in New York? They're going to move as soon as they can. The minute they have children, they're moving. Do you want that to happen to your tax base? It is the responsibility of the political class to look at the lives of the people who are the lifeblood of the city. Affordable housing is a real important part of that. There are a million arguments for deregulation, for regulation. Solve the problem of affordable housing. Stop debating, figure it out, and do it. It doesn't mean housing for just the poor. It means having police officers, firefighters, and teachers who can afford to live in the city where they work. If they live somewhere else, do you think they understand who they're teaching, protecting, saving? They don't. They can't. They don't live with you.
You talk about the political class. Are we not now looking at a different class called career politicians?
Called what, Michael?
Career politicians. And how do you convince them to do what's right for the people rather than what's right for them?
It's, you know, we're supposed to have a citizen-based political class. It hasn't been that way for probably 200 years. People in Congress vote in their self-interest, not just their district's interest. People in mayoral offices are thinking about the job that they get when they get out of that office. One of the best things we have are term limits, where you can replace people if they don't do the job. And the thing you really look for is people with a moral center. And one hopes we can find them that aren't just among the philanthropic Bloomberg class, but among regular people who ought to be in office. We struggle with that. We struggle with that a great deal. You'd be hard-pressed to name who the legislators are in Albany. There's a reason the state capitol is very far away from the population center. They're happy and private up there. There are 3 men in a room, that used to be called, that decide the fate of the state. We need to get away from that, and we're not quite there.
Part of the problem is campaign financing. And you talk about term limits, and yeah, that's important, an important principle of democracy. But the fact of the matter is that the incumbency has a huge advantage.
Incumbency always has a huge advantage. Comes with the territory. If you're a Manhattan district attorney, you'd have to fail miserably to not get 2 to 3 terms in that office. And very few people leave an office like that. Morgenthau stayed 40 years. Hogan stayed more than 40 years. It's a long haul for someone in a job. But campaign financing is the key. And you hit it on the head. Our campaign financing system leaves politicians at the risk of being beholden to those who have the most money. Do away with that and you level the playing field. And that hasn't happened yet. It's better than it was in New York. It's terrible on a national level. To have hundreds and hundreds of millions as the requirement to run for office says all you need to know about what's wrong with campaign finance in the current state. Money from political PACs, money that you can't even trace back to the donor. That's a remarkable thing, right? You're going to fund a political office, and I don't know who you are or where the money comes from.
Richard, I really want to thank you for being here today. It's been a great, wide-ranging, and interesting conversation. Keep doing what you're doing. We need more people like you.
Thank you so much, Michael.
As we close today's episode of Building Bridges, that which unites us, I'm reminded of how essential it is to listen to and appreciate the stories of others. By sharing our diverse experiences, we can better understand the challenges people face and more often than not discover more similarities than differences. Thank you for joining us today. With every conversation, we have the opportunity to build bridges, that which unites us.